If you enjoy stories that feel real, touch your heart, and leave you thinking long after they end, then you're in the right place. Welcome to Mr. Wisdom Stories. Trevor was still smiling when he called his wife a joke. The rooftop gathering in Midtown Atlanta had been going well. It was a Friday night, warm enough for people to stand outside comfortably, and the city lights stretched behind the small groups gathered around the tables. Someone had brought food. Someone else had taken control of the music. Conversations moved easily from work complaints to rent, family problems, travel plans, and the small frustrations that came with getting older and having less free time than anyone expected. Trevor had spent most of the evening doing what he did best, making people laugh. Now he stood with several friends near the center of the rooftop, telling a story about an argument he and Naomi had had a few weeks earlier. "And I'm telling you," Trevor said, lifting his hands dramatically, "she looked at me like I had personally ruined the entire weekend." A few people laughed. Naomi stood a few feet away with a drink in her hand. Trevor continued. "What did I even do?" he asked, pretending to search his memory. "Apparently, I forgot one tiny little thing." "You made other plans," Naomi said quietly. Trevor turned toward her with a grin. "See?" he said to the group. "This is exactly what I mean. She remembers everything." More laughter. Naomi looked down at her glass. The real argument had not been about Trevor forgetting one small thing. He had promised to help Naomi prepare for an important family gathering at their apartment. She had spent days organizing everything because several relatives were coming, including family members she did not see often. Trevor had promised he would be home early. Instead, he made plans with someone else. Then he forgot to tell Naomi. By the time she found out, most of the work was already waiting for her. But that was not the version Trevor was telling. In Trevor's version, Naomi had become upset over nothing. "I walk in," Trevor said, beginning to imitate her voice, "and she's standing there like, 'Trevor, I just need to understand why you don't respect my time.'" A louder round of laughter followed. Trevor laughed too. Naomi had heard that imitation before. Different argument, different room, same voice, same version of her. Trevor continued telling the story, making himself sound confused, harmless, and completely unprepared for the woman he had supposedly come home to. Then he shook his head and laughed. "Honestly, when she gets worked up like that, she's a complete joke." A few people laughed. Trevor's smile stayed in place. But Naomi did not laugh. She looked at him. For a moment, Trevor could not understand what he was seeing on her face. It was not the expression he expected. She was not furious. She was not preparing a response. She was not giving him that look he sometimes joked about later. She simply looked tired. Not tired from the party, not tired from the week, tired of something much older. Then Naomi placed her drink on the nearest table. She picked up her bag, and she walked toward the elevator. Trevor's smile disappeared. "Naomi?" She did not stop. "Naomi, where are you going?" A couple of people looked between them. Trevor laughed once, but it sounded forced. "She's probably about to give me another performance review," he said. Nobody laughed that time. Naomi reached the elevator. The doors opened. She stepped inside. Trevor followed. "Seriously?" he asked as the doors closed. "You're leaving?" Naomi pressed the lobby button. Trevor stared at her. "Are you mad?" She said nothing. That was when he became nervous. "Naomi." The elevator moved downward. Still nothing. Trevor followed her through the lobby and outside toward the rideshare pickup area. "Would you just tell me what is wrong?" Naomi stopped. She looked at him for several seconds, then she said, "Nothing you haven't done before." Trevor immediately frowned. "Oh, come on." Naomi looked away. "I'm serious." "And so am I," Trevor said. "What did I do?" She gave a short, humorless breath. "I just don't think you understand what you've been doing to me." Trevor folded his arms. "Naomi, I was joking." She turned back toward him. "That's what scares me." Trevor's expression changed. "You still think that's the important part. Welcome to Mr. Wisdom Stories. Fictional stories about human choices, unexpected turns, and the things we sometimes learn too late. Let's begin. If you believe a partner's private pain should never become public entertainment, take a moment to like this story and share your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps more people find stories that explore the choices, mistakes, and consequences people sometimes recognize too late. 4 days later, Trevor was lying awake in the apartment he and Naomi had shared for years. The room was dark. Naomi's side of the bed was empty. At first he thought she might have fallen asleep on the couch. Then he noticed her work bag was gone. Her phone charger was gone too. Most of her things were still there. Her clothes, her shoes, her books. The small pieces of everyday life that made the apartment feel shared. Trevor reached for his phone. There was one message from Naomi. "I'm safe. I need some space. Please don't turn this into another argument." He read it again. Then his phone vibrated. Another message. This one was from one of his oldest friends. "I should have said something that night. What you did was worse than you think." Trevor stared at both messages. For the first time, Naomi's silence did not feel like anger. It did not feel like the beginning of another argument. And it did not feel like something he could solve by saying sorry and waiting for things to return to normal. What frightened him was something much worse. Naomi had been telling him for years that his jokes were hurting her. So why did she choose this particular night to stop speaking? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning, back to the man everybody liked, and the woman who once believed being patient would eventually be enough. Trevor had always been the kind of man people remembered after meeting him once. At 36, he could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 3 new phone numbers, an invitation to dinner, and a story everyone would still be repeating the next week. He worked in business development for a software company, a job that suited him almost perfectly. He knew how to make people feel comfortable. He remembered small details. He could turn an awkward silence into a laugh before most people had time to notice it. Naomi used to think that was one of the best things about him. She was 29 and worked as an operations coordinator for a non-profit organization. Her days were built around schedules, budgets, deadlines, meetings, and the quiet work of making sure important things did not fall apart because someone forgot to follow through. Trevor used to tease her about that. "You were born 40 years old," he would say. "And you were born without a calendar," Naomi would answer. He would laugh. She usually would too. They had been married for 4 years, and from the outside they seemed like a couple who had figured out how to balance each other. Trevor made life less serious. Naomi made life more stable. He encouraged her to go out when she wanted to stay home after a difficult week. She reminded him about appointments, deadlines, and commitments he genuinely intended to remember, but often did not. Their disagreements were ordinary. Sometimes Trevor spent more money than they had planned. Sometimes Naomi became frustrated when he changed plans at the last minute. Sometimes he wanted to spend another Saturday with friends when she had expected them to visit her family. Sometimes she became quiet instead of immediately saying what was bothering her. None of it seemed unusual. That was why Naomi did not initially see anything dangerous in the way Trevor talked about their disagreements. One Saturday evening, they attended a birthday dinner for a friend in Atlanta. The restaurant was crowded and Trevor seemed completely at home. Naomi watched him greet people as they arrived. "Look who finally made it," Trevor said when one couple entered late. The husband raised his hands. "Traffic, sure." "I'm serious. Everybody's serious when they're late." The group laughed. Trevor pulled out a chair for Naomi as she sat down beside him. She smiled at him. Later, during dinner, someone mentioned how difficult it could be to coordinate family visits. Trevor immediately turned toward the group. "Oh, Naomi could teach a class on that." Naomi glanced at him. "Don't start. See? I haven't even said anything." "Exactly." The table laughed. Naomi shook her head, smiling despite herself. Trevor leaned back. "Last month my mother called and asked if we wanted to come over Sunday. Just Sunday lunch. Simple, right?" Naomi knew where this was going. She had not been angry about lunch. She had been frustrated because Trevor had already agreed that they would spend that weekend helping her sister move. Then, without discussing it with Naomi, he told his mother they would probably come. Naomi had spent 20 minutes explaining why changing plans affected other people. Trevor had apologized. They had worked it out. At least Naomi thought they had. Trevor continued. "So my wife looks at me and says, 'Trevor, you cannot just tell people we'll be somewhere when you haven't even asked me.'" His imitation was gentle enough to make the group laugh. Naomi laughed too. Then Trevor added, "And I'm standing there thinking, it's lunch. We're not negotiating an international agreement." More laughter. Naomi smiled because everyone else was smiling. Trevor reached for her hand under the table. She squeezed his fingers. For the rest of the evening, nothing seemed wrong. They talked with friends. They ate too much. Trevor told another story about a disastrous client meeting and made himself the foolish one that time. Naomi laughed harder than anyone. On the drive home, Trevor was still energized. "Good night," he said. "It was. You barely talked. I talked. You know what I mean." Naomi looked out the window. The streets were quieter now. "I was listening." Trevor glanced at her. "Did I do something?" No. He accepted the answer and turned his attention back to the road. But Naomi kept thinking about the story he had told. Not because he had mentioned their disagreement, and not because people had laughed. It was the details. Trevor had made her sound as if she had objected to lunch itself. He had left out the moving plans. He had left out the fact that his mother had called only after they had already made another commitment. He had left out his apology. None of those details would have made the story as funny. By the time they reached their apartment, Naomi had almost convinced herself she was overthinking it. Trevor unlocked the door. "Hey," he said, looking back at her. "You coming?" Naomi followed him inside. A few minutes later, while Trevor changed into comfortable clothes, she stood in the bedroom doorway. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "When you told that story tonight, why did you leave out the part about my sister moving?" Trevor looked at her. "What?" "The lunch story." He thought for a moment. "Because that wasn't the funny part." Naomi waited. Trevor smiled. "Naomi, I wasn't trying to make you look bad." "I know, I was just telling a story." She nodded slowly. "Okay." Trevor seemed relieved. He kissed her forehead and walked toward the kitchen. Naomi stayed where she was for a moment. She did not feel angry, not yet, but something about the answer stayed with her, because Trevor had said he was only telling a story, and technically he was. The problem was that Naomi had lived the real version, and for the first time she wondered what happened when the person you loved began telling your life in a way that slowly made you unrecognizable. The first time Naomi confronted Trevor about it, she expected the conversation to be simple. She had already decided she was not going to accuse him of trying to hurt her. She knew Trevor well enough to believe he had not sat at that birthday dinner thinking about how to embarrass his wife. That was almost what made the conversation harder. They were eating breakfast the following morning when Naomi brought it up. Trevor was standing at the counter with his phone in one hand and a mug in the other. "Can I ask you something about last night?" He looked up. "Sure." "When you told the story about your mother inviting us to lunch, did you realize you made me sound unreasonable?" Trevor frowned. "No, I did." He set his phone down. "Naomi, I was joking." "I know." "Then what are we talking about?" She took a breath. "The actual problem wasn't that your mother invited us somewhere. You had already agreed to help my sister move. Then you told your mother we might come without asking me. That's what we argued about." "I know that, but nobody listening knew that." Trevor leaned against the counter. "It was a quick story, and in the quick version I sounded like I was upset over lunch." He looked at her for a moment. "Okay, I can see that." Naomi relaxed slightly. Then Trevor smiled. "But you did get pretty worked up." Her expression changed. Trevor immediately noticed. "What? That? What? You just did it again." "Did what?" "Made the funny part my reaction." Trevor stared at her. "I thought it was funny." Naomi looked down at her breakfast. "I didn't." The silence between them lasted longer than Trevor expected. Finally he said, "I wasn't trying to embarrass you. I believe you. You know I love you." "I know." "Then why are you making this sound so serious?" Naomi looked at him. "Because I'm trying to tell you something before it becomes serious." Trevor's face softened. He came around the counter and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry." She nodded. That should have been the end of it. For a while, Naomi thought it was. Then came their anniversary. Trevor had booked a restaurant weeks earlier. At least that was what he told Naomi. She had been looking forward to it because both of them had been busy, and the last few months had been filled with work, family obligations, and plans that kept getting moved. That evening, Naomi got dressed early. Trevor came out of the bedroom looking uneasy. "What?" she asked. He checked his phone. "So," Naomi immediately stopped what she was doing. "What happened?" Trevor rubbed the back of his neck. "The reservation was for last night." Naomi stared at him. "What?" "I put the wrong date in my calendar." "You booked the wrong night?" "No, I booked the right night. I just thought tonight was the right night." Naomi said nothing. Trevor gave her a nervous smile. "We can still find somewhere else." That was not what upset her. What upset her was that Trevor had known about the anniversary dinner for weeks and had still managed to leave the details until the last minute. They argued. Not loudly. Naomi asked why she always seemed to be the one checking dates and confirming plans. Trevor said it was an honest mistake. She said an honest mistake could still disappoint someone. He apologized. They found another restaurant. By the end of dinner, they had moved on. A week later, they met some friends for drinks. Someone asked Trevor how his anniversary had gone. Trevor laughed. "Oh, you should have seen Naomi's face when I told her I'd missed the reservation." Naomi looked at him. Trevor continued. She was sitting there in this dress, fully ready, and I'm like, "Baby, I have some news." He imitated her expression. The table laughed. Trevor shook his head. "I thought she was going to file for divorce over a reservation." Naomi forced a smile. She did not want to ruin the evening, but something inside her tightened. It was becoming familiar. The thing Trevor had done was reduced. Her reaction became enlarged. Later, in the car, she said, "That bothered me." Trevor sighed. "Again?" Naomi turned toward him. "What do you mean again?" "You know what I mean." "No, tell me." Trevor kept his eyes on the road. "Naomi, I apologized for the reservation. This isn't about the reservation." "Then what is it about?" "It's about what you do afterward." He said nothing. "You keep taking something that happened between us and turning it into a story where I'm the unreasonable one. That's not fair, isn't it?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because you always make me sound like I'm doing something terrible." Naomi became quiet. Trevor heard the change in her breathing. "That came out wrong," he said. "But that's the problem." "What?" "I'm not saying you're terrible." "You make it sound like I am." "No, I'm telling you what your stories do to me." Trevor gripped the steering wheel. "I wasn't trying to hurt you." Naomi looked out the window. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said, "I keep telling you that, but somehow we always end up talking about what you meant instead." Trevor had no answer. 2 months later, they had another disagreement. They had agreed to save extra money for a future trip. Then Trevor bought expensive tickets to an event with friends. When Naomi noticed the charge, she asked him about it. He said he had forgotten about their savings plan. Naomi reminded him that they had discussed it. Trevor apologized. He said he would replace the money. The conversation ended there. But the following weekend, Trevor told the story differently. He described Naomi looking at their bank account as if she were conducting an investigation. He copied her serious voice. He made his friends laugh. Naomi laughed too. That was what frightened her later. She was beginning to learn how to survive the moment. Smile, let everyone else laugh, wait until they were alone, explain. Listen to Trevor apologize. Accept the apology. Then hope the next time would be different. One evening, after another small disagreement, Naomi caught herself stopping mid-sentence. Trevor was sitting across from her on the couch. "What?" he asked. "Nothing." "You were going to say something." Naomi shook her head. "Never mind." "Naomi," she looked at him. Then she asked, "Are you going to tell someone this later?" Trevor blinked. "What? The argument? Why would I?" "I don't know." The answer disturbed her because she realized she genuinely did not know anymore. Trevor looked offended. "You think I'm going to run around telling people everything we talk about?" "No." "Then why ask?" Naomi lowered her eyes. "Because I'm starting to wonder which parts of my life are safe to tell you." She did not say it. Not yet. Instead, she smiled faintly and said, "Forget it." Trevor nodded, relieved to leave the subject behind. But Naomi could not, because something had changed. Before she told Trevor something personal, she had started thinking beyond the moment. Would this stay between us? If we argue, will this become funny later? Will someone who was not there hear a version of me I do not recognize? And the worst part was that Trevor still seemed genuinely confused. He thought being funny proved he meant no harm. Naomi was beginning to understand that intent and impact could live in the same room without being the same thing. And every time Trevor apologized without changing what happened next, the apology became harder for her to trust. The change did not happen all at once. Naomi did not wake up one morning and decide that Trevor could no longer be trusted with her thoughts. Instead, she began leaving things out. At work, she occasionally dealt with situations that were frustrating enough to follow her home. One afternoon, a meeting at the non-profit ran nearly an hour longer than scheduled because several people had arrived without the information they were supposed to bring. Naomi came home tired. Trevor was in the kitchen. "How was your day?" She opened her mouth. Normally she would have told him everything. She would have described the meeting, the excuses, and the moment she had to repeat the same question 3 times before anyone answered it. But then she pictured Trevor telling the story later. She imagined him copying her serious voice. She imagined someone laughing. "It was fine," she said. Trevor looked at her. "Fine? Long? That's all I get." Naomi opened the refrigerator. "I'm tired." Trevor accepted the answer. He did not notice that this had become more common. Naomi still talked to him. They still discussed bills, groceries, family plans, work schedules, and the ordinary decisions of married life. But she was no longer as open. The details that carried embarrassment, disappointment, frustration, or uncertainty began staying with her. Sometimes she told a friend instead. Sometimes she wrote nothing down and carried the thoughts until they passed. Sometimes she started to speak to Trevor and changed her mind halfway through. He noticed some of it, but he misunderstood what he was seeing. "You've been stressed lately," he told her one evening. "I know." "Work? Partly?" Trevor nodded. He did not ask what the other part was. Naomi did not volunteer it. Their arguments changed too. Before, Naomi would keep talking until she felt Trevor understood her. Now, she became careful. If he apologized too quickly, she often accepted it. If he misunderstood her, she sometimes corrected him once and then stopped. Trevor interpreted the shorter arguments as improvement. Naomi experienced them differently. She was conserving herself. Their social life continued. They still attended birthdays, dinners, weddings, and occasional weekend gatherings with the people Trevor seemed to know everywhere. Some were old college friends, some were former co-workers. Some were couples they had become close to over the years. Trevor moved easily through all of those groups. He remembered who had changed jobs. He knew who had recently moved. He could sit beside someone he had not seen in months and begin talking as if no time had passed. Naomi often stood beside him smiling. People liked her too. She was easier to talk to than she sometimes realized. She listened carefully. She asked good questions. She remembered details. But Trevor usually carried the center of the conversation. Naomi did not mind that at first. Later, she began finding comfort in it. If she stayed quiet, she did not have to worry about giving Trevor new material. One Sunday, while they were getting ready for another gathering, Trevor adjusted his shirt in front of the mirror. "You know people keep asking about you when you don't come." Naomi was sitting on the edge of the bed. "Who?" "Everybody." "That is not an answer." Trevor smiled. "You know what I mean." She looked at him. "Then tell me." He laughed. "People miss you." Naomi looked down at her phone. "That's nice." Trevor stopped adjusting his collar. "You don't want to go?" "I didn't say that you didn't say you did either." Naomi considered telling him the truth. Sometimes social events had become exhausting, not because she disliked their friends, because she never knew when an ordinary private moment would return to her through someone else's laughter. But she did not say that. Instead, she said, "I'm tired." Trevor sat beside her. "You've been tired a lot. I know. You should come tonight." Naomi looked at him. "Why?" "Because I want my wife there." The answer made her smile despite herself. Trevor took her hand. "And because people ask where you are." "There it is." "What?" "The real reason." Trevor laughed. "No, that's not the real reason." "Sure, I'm serious." Naomi looked at him for a moment. Trevor still had the ability to make her doubt her own frustration. Not because he was deliberately trying to manipulate her. Sometimes he was simply so warm, so convincing, and so certain that he loved her that she wondered whether she was making too much of things. That was one reason she had stayed quiet. The marriage was not unhappy every day. There were mornings when Trevor made coffee before she woke up. There were nights when they watched television and laughed at something so stupid that Naomi had to cover her face. There were moments when he reached for her hand without thinking. Those moments were real too. That was what made everything else difficult. Naomi did not want to turn Trevor into a villain in her own mind. She wanted him to understand one simple thing. Some stories belonged to the people who had lived them. A few weeks later, Trevor received an invitation to a Friday night rooftop gathering in Midtown Atlanta. He mentioned it while Naomi was clearing dishes after dinner. "Friday," he said. "You're free, right?" Naomi looked at him. "What Friday?" "The rooftop thing." She paused. "You already said yes?" "I said we'd probably come." Naomi stared at him. Trevor stopped, then he smiled. "Okay, I heard it." Naomi almost laughed. "That's progress. I'm learning." She looked at him carefully. For a moment, the old warmth returned. Then Trevor added, "So you're coming?" "I don't know, Naomi." "What?" "You've skipped the last two things. I had reasons." "You had reasons for one, and the other?" "You said you were tired." "I was." Trevor leaned against the counter. "You've been pulling away from people." Naomi looked at him. The statement landed harder than he understood. "I have?" "Yes." She picked up another plate. "Maybe I just don't feel like talking all the time." "Fine, you don't have to talk." "That sounds pleasant." Trevor smiled. "You know what I mean." Naomi set the plate down. "Do I?" His smile faded slightly. For a moment, Trevor seemed close to asking the question she wanted him to ask. "Are you pulling away from me too?" But he did not. Instead, he said, "I just think you should come." Naomi turned back to the sink. "Why does it matter so much?" Trevor was quiet. Then he answered, "Because I miss having you there." She stopped. This time, she believed him. That was the complicated truth about Trevor. He could hurt her without wanting to hurt her. He could apologize without fully understanding what he was apologizing for. And he could love her while still failing to protect the parts of her life she trusted him to hold carefully. Naomi agreed to go. By Friday evening, she was already regretting it. She had spent the week handling work problems, helping with a family matter, and pretending she was less tired than she actually felt. Standing in front of the bedroom mirror, she adjusted her clothes and looked at Trevor behind her. "You ready?" he asked. "No," Trevor laughed. "I appreciate the honesty." Naomi smiled faintly. "Give me 5 minutes." He nodded and left the room. Naomi looked at herself again. She had no idea that she was getting ready for the last gathering she would attend before everything between them changed. And she had no idea that, before the night was over, the same man she had spent years trying to explain herself to would finally become afraid of her silence. Naomi regretted agreeing to go before they had even left the apartment. Not because Trevor had done anything wrong that evening. That almost made it worse. He had been unusually thoughtful since their conversation in the kitchen. He gave her time to finish getting ready without rushing her. He did not make another joke about how long she was taking. When she finally walked into the living room, he looked up from his phone. "You look nice." Naomi glanced down at herself. "Thank you." Trevor stood. "Ready?" "No," he smiled. "Honest answer." Naomi picked up her bag. "I said I would go. You don't have to stay all night." "That sounds like a trap." "It's not." She looked at him. Trevor raised both hands. "I'm serious. We can leave whenever you want." Naomi studied his face for a second, then nodded. "Okay." The drive into Midtown was quiet at first. Traffic moved slowly, and Trevor kept one hand on the steering wheel while the other tapped against his leg in time with the music playing softly through the car. After a few minutes, he looked at Naomi. "You're really tired." "I know. Work? Work, family stuff, everything." Trevor nodded. "You should have let me order dinner." "You offered after I'd already cooked." "I still offered." Naomi smiled faintly. "That counts for something." "Exactly." For a few minutes, the conversation was easy. That was still possible between them. Trevor could make her laugh without trying very hard. He told her about something that had happened during a meeting at work, and this time the person making the mistake was clearly him. "I told them I had a solution," he said. "And did you?" "No," Naomi laughed. "What happened?" "I spent 10 minutes talking like I knew exactly what I was doing." "And?" "And somebody asked me to explain the technical part." Naomi laughed harder. Trevor shook his head. "I have never wanted a fire alarm more in my life." "That would have been your best escape plan?" "At that point, yes." Naomi leaned back in her seat. For a moment she remembered why being around Trevor had once felt so easy. He had never needed a perfect day to make something funny. A delayed train, a bad restaurant, an embarrassing mistake at work. Trevor could find something worth laughing about in almost anything. Years earlier, Naomi had thought that quality would make difficult parts of life easier to survive. She had not yet understood that humor could become complicated when one person always decided where the joke ended. The rooftop gathering was already underway when they arrived. The elevator opened onto a wide outdoor space filled with small groups of people talking over low music. Folding tables held trays of food, bottles of water, napkins, and paper plates. A few people stood near the edge of the rooftop, looking out at the Atlanta skyline, while others had gathered around chairs and high tables. Trevor changed almost immediately, not into a different person, just into the version of himself that seemed to become larger in a crowd. "Finally," he called as they stepped outside. Naomi looked at him. "We're not late." "We're emotionally late. That means nothing. It means we took too long." Several people nearby laughed. Trevor smiled and moved toward them. Naomi followed more slowly. For the first few minutes, she stayed beside him. Then she found herself near the drinks table talking with 2 people about work. One conversation became another. Someone complained about rent. Someone else said they were thinking about moving but had not found anywhere they could afford. A married couple discussed how much money they had spent on childcare that month. Another person described a travel plan that had become more expensive than expected. Naomi listened, then, without realizing it, she began contributing. "Did you check the fees before you booked?" One person groaned. "No." Naomi smiled. "That's always where they get you." "Are you speaking from experience?" "I work in operations. I assume every number is lying to me until somebody proves otherwise." The small group laughed. Naomi smiled. She felt herself relaxing. Trevor was nearby, moving between conversations with the same confidence he had shown since they arrived. He greeted people Naomi had not yet seen, remembered details about their lives, and seemed to know exactly when to stay in one conversation and when to move to another. Naomi watched him from across the rooftop. For a brief moment she felt something close to affection without hesitation. This was the Trevor she had known before everything became so complicated. The man who could make strangers feel included. The man who could make a crowded room feel less uncomfortable. The man who had once made Naomi believe that even their differences could become part of what made them work. Trevor looked across the rooftop and caught her watching him. He smiled. Naomi smiled back. Then she returned to her conversation. She did not notice how much time had passed until someone nearby began talking about marriage. It started with a complaint about a spouse changing plans. Another person laughed. "That's nothing," someone said. "Try living with somebody who asks where something is before they even look for it." Several people joined in. Soon everyone had a story. Arguments about money, arguments about chores, arguments about family visits, arguments about whose turn it was to handle something that neither person wanted to handle. The mood was light. Naomi listened without feeling uncomfortable. Then Trevor's voice carried across the small group. "Oh, I have one." Naomi looked up. Trevor was smiling. He had turned toward several people standing near him. "I have a perfect story for this." Something in Naomi tightened. She knew before he said another word, not because she knew exactly which argument he had chosen, because she recognized the tone, the slight excitement in his voice, the way he glanced around to make sure people were listening. Naomi lowered her drink. Trevor lifted one hand. "So, a few weeks ago." Naomi closed her eyes for half a second. There it was. A few weeks ago. She knew the beginning. Trevor had promised to help her prepare for an important family gathering at their apartment. He had forgotten. Then he had made other plans. And instead of telling Naomi immediately, he waited until late in the day, when most of the responsibility had already fallen onto her. She opened her eyes. Trevor was still speaking. "And I come home, right?" Naomi stood completely still. The general marriage conversation was gone now. The rooftop gathering had become something else. A private argument she thought belonged only to her, and Trevor was about to be handed to a group of people who had not lived any part of it, and Naomi already knew which version of her husband would be telling it. Trevor smiled as the people around him waited. Naomi knew that smile. It was not cruel. That was part of the problem. He looked pleased with himself, already arranging the story in his mind, deciding which details would make people laugh and which details were too ordinary to mention. "So," Trevor said, "a few weeks ago, we had this family thing coming up." Naomi lowered her eyes to her glass. Trevor continued. Naomi had this whole schedule. A few people smiled. He held his hands apart, as though describing something enormous. Cleaning, food, timing, who was bringing what time people were arriving, everything. Naomi said nothing. The real situation had been simple. Several members of her family were coming to their apartment. Some of them had not visited in a long time. Naomi had spent days preparing because she wanted the gathering to go smoothly. Trevor had promised to help. He had agreed to clean, pick up a few things they needed, and be home early enough to handle part of the preparation. Then he forgot. Or, more accurately, he remembered too late. A friend had invited him to spend the afternoon somewhere else, and Trevor agreed without checking the plans he had already made with Naomi. He did not tell her immediately. Naomi discovered it late in the day when she asked what time he would be home. Trevor had said, "I might be a little later than I thought." A little later had turned into several hours. Naomi had done most of the work alone. When Trevor finally returned, she had been tired, disappointed, and angry. She had not screamed. She had not thrown anything. She had asked him why he had promised to help if he was going to make other plans and leave her to discover the change after everything was already falling onto her. But that was not Trevor's version. "By the time I get home," he said, "she's standing there with this face." He copied Naomi's expression. People laughed. Naomi felt heat rise into her face. Trevor continued, and she goes, "Trevor, I need you to explain something to me." His imitation was sharper this time. Naomi looked down. She had said those words, but she had not said them the way he was saying them now. "And I'm thinking, okay, what happened?" He paused. "Apparently I forgot I was supposed to be on duty." More laughter. Trevor grinned. Naomi's fingers tightened around her glass. "Then she starts listing everything I did wrong." He began counting on his fingers. "You promised to clean." A finger. "You promised to shop." Another finger. You promised to be home early. Another. And I'm just standing there thinking, wow, this sounds less like marriage and more like an employee performance review. The people closest to him laughed loudly. Naomi did not look up. The real argument had not been a list designed to humiliate him. She had been trying to explain why she felt abandoned with responsibilities he had agreed to share. But the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Trevor was doing exactly what he had done before. He was taking the part of the story that explained his behavior and making it disappear. Then he was taking her response and placing it under a brighter light. She thought of the anniversary reservation, the money they had agreed to save, the family visit he had changed without asking her, the conversations afterward. I thought it was funny. I wasn't trying to embarrass you. You know I love you. The words came back to her with sudden clarity. For years, Naomi had treated each incident as its own problem. A story about a reservation, a story about money, a story about her family, a story about her reaction. She had explained them one by one. Now, standing on the rooftop, she saw what she had failed to name. It was not one story, it was the same story, again and again. Trevor kept talking. And the best part is I apologized. Naomi looked up. Trevor had his hands raised. I said, I'm sorry, I forgot. What more do you want from me? Someone laughed. Trevor shook his head as though he had spent his entire marriage trying to understand a problem with no solution. Naomi felt something inside her become very still. She had heard this version of herself before. Not these exact words, but the same shape. Trevor as the confused man who had made an understandable mistake. Naomi as the woman who refused to let a mistake go. And because Trevor was charming, because he could make people laugh, because he told stories with such confidence, his version usually arrived before hers. Not that anyone had ever asked for her version. That was another realization Naomi had never allowed herself to fully consider. When Trevor told these stories, people did not turn to her and ask whether that was what happened. They laughed because laughter was what the story asked of them. Trevor was still speaking. She kept going for 20 minutes. Naomi stared at him. That was not true. She remembered the argument. She remembered looking at the clock because she was too tired to continue. She remembered walking away before Trevor had finished trying to convince her that she was overreacting. But Trevor had never experienced memory the way Naomi did. For him, the facts of a story could move if the movement made the story better. He did not think of that as lying. Naomi had once accepted that explanation. Now she wondered why she had been expected to accept it. Trevor leaned closer to the group. So finally I tell her, Naomi, I understand you're upset. He paused for effect. Big mistake. More laughter. Naomi looked around. Not everyone was laughing. One person had become quiet, another looked down at the food table, someone gave a short laugh and then stopped. But Trevor did not notice. He was watching the people who were responding. He was feeding off the sound. Naomi suddenly understood something else. Trevor was not looking at her. Not really. She was standing only a few feet away, holding the drink he had seen her carrying when he began the story. But she had become part of the performance, not his wife. Not the person who had spent years trying to explain why this hurt, just the subject of the joke. Trevor laughed again. Then he said it. Honestly, when she gets worked up like that, she's a complete joke. For a second, the room did exactly what Trevor expected. Some people laughed. Then the sound changed. It did not grow. It fell apart. A few people stopped almost immediately. Others remained silent. Trevor smiled, waiting for Naomi to react. That was when he finally looked at her. Naomi was staring at him. She was not angry in the way he had expected. There was no sharp response, no argument, no demand that he apologize in front of everyone. Trevor could not immediately read her face. That unsettled him. Naomi had spent years giving him reactions. She had explained. She had corrected him. She had argued over details. She had asked him to understand. And every reaction had eventually become part of another conversation in which Trevor focused on how strongly she had responded. She was not going to give him another one. Not there. Not with people watching. Not when even her anger could become something Trevor might later repeat. Naomi looked down at her drink. Slowly, she placed it on the nearest table. Trevor's smile faded. Naomi? She did not answer. She reached for her bag. One of the people nearby shifted slightly, as though unsure whether to say something. Naomi lifted the bag onto her shoulder. Trevor laughed once. It was a nervous sound. Come on. Naomi walked away. At first, Trevor did not move. He seemed to believe she was going to the restroom. Then Naomi passed the table of food. She continued toward the elevator. Trevor turned toward her. Naomi! She kept walking. The people around him had become quiet. Trevor looked back at them. Nobody was laughing now. Then he looked at Naomi again. She reached the elevator. The doors opened, and for the first time that night, Trevor understood that she was not walking away to cool down. She was leaving. Trevor reached the elevator just before the doors closed. Naomi, she looked straight ahead. Are you serious? The elevator doors shut behind them. Trevor pressed the lobby button even though she already had. Naomi said nothing. His irritation rose almost immediately. He knew he had said something wrong. He could feel that much. But leaving? Walking away in front of everyone? To Trevor, the reaction seemed larger than the joke. Naomi, come on! She kept looking at the numbers above the door. It was a joke. Still nothing. That silence bothered him more than anger would have. Trevor knew how to handle Naomi when she was upset. At least he thought he did. She would explain, he would respond, they would disagree over what had happened. Eventually, one of them would apologize and the conversation would end. But Naomi was giving him nothing. The elevator reached the lobby. She stepped out first. Trevor followed her. Are you actually going home? Yes. Just like that? Naomi kept walking. Trevor caught up with her near the exit. Are you really going to leave because of one joke? That made her stop. She turned around. Trevor felt a brief sense of relief. Finally, a reaction. Then Naomi said, Nothing you haven't done before. His relief disappeared. What does that mean? It means exactly what I said. Naomi, you're acting like He stopped himself. Like what? She asked. Trevor looked away for a moment. The answer came to him too quickly, like I did something terrible. But he knew better than to say that. Instead he said, Like I humiliated you on purpose. Naomi's face remained calm. I know you didn't do it on purpose. Then why are we here? She looked toward the exit. Because I took this seriously years ago. Trevor frowned. What? I told you. About what? Naomi looked back at him. About telling people private things. Trevor shook his head. No, this is different. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. I told one story. Naomi gave a short breath that was almost a laugh. There. What? You still think tonight is about one story? Trevor felt his frustration returning. Then explain it to me. Naomi was quiet. For years she would have taken that invitation. She would have started with the anniversary reservation, then the money they had agreed to save, then the family visit, then the earlier conversation about Trevor telling their disagreements in ways that made her sound unreasonable. She would have given him dates, examples, exact words. She would have built the entire case carefully enough that he could not say she had been unclear. But standing there, Naomi understood what that would mean. Another explanation, another defense, another conversation in which Trevor examined whether each individual example was serious enough to justify her feelings. She was exhausted by the thought. Trevor waited. Naomi? She looked at him. I don't think you notice when you make me smaller anymore. The words landed harder than he expected. Trevor's face tightened. What does that even mean? It means you take something I care about, remove the part that explains why I was hurt, and then show people my reaction. That's not what I do. You just did it upstairs. I told a story. You told your version. Of course I told my version. It happened to me too. Naomi nodded. Yes. Trevor seemed relieved. But your version is not the only version. He stared at her. What exactly did I leave out? Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Trevor saw the change. What? That? What did I say? You want me to prove it? No. I'm asking a question. And that's what always happens. Trevor stepped closer. Naomi, if I did something wrong, tell me. I have. Then tell me again. She looked at him. Something in her expression changed. Not anger, not defeat. Decision. I don't want to. Trevor was silent. Naomi continued. I don't want to explain another example to you so you can decide whether I explained it correctly enough. That is not what I do. Naomi said nothing. Trevor immediately heard the problem. Okay, maybe sometimes I get defensive. Sometimes? Fine, more than sometimes. Naomi looked toward the rideshare area outside. Trevor followed her as she stepped through the doors. Cars moved slowly along the pickup lane. Naomi opened her phone. Trevor stared at her. You're really leaving? Yes. Where are you going? Home, Trevor laughed nervously. So we're going home together. I'll take a ride. His face changed. What? I need to be alone. Naomi, don't do this. She looked at him. Do what? Turn this into something bigger than it is. The moment he said it, Trevor knew he had chosen the wrong words. Naomi's expression did not change, but she lowered her phone. Bigger than it is? That's not what I meant. What did you mean? Trevor rubbed his forehead. I meant we should talk. We've talked. Then we can talk better. Naomi almost smiled. You always think the next conversation will fix the last one. Trevor stepped toward her. Because I'm trying. Naomi looked at him carefully. For the first time that night, Trevor saw tears in her eyes. She did not let them fall. That's what makes this so difficult. Trevor said nothing. Naomi continued. I know you're trying in the moment. I know you feel sorry after I'm upset. I know you love me. His face softened. Then, but you keep returning to the same thing. Trevor stopped. Naomi looked down at her phone. I don't think you understand what you've been doing to me. He heard the words, but his mind immediately moved toward an answer. I was joking. Naomi closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she looked more tired than angry. That's what scares me. Trevor stared at her. You still think that's the important part? For several seconds he had nothing to say. A car arrived nearby. Naomi checked her phone. Trevor looked toward the vehicle, then back at her. Are you seriously getting in that car? Yes. Naomi, please. I'm going home. I can drive you. I need space. His frustration returned, mixed now with something he did not want to name, fear. Space for what? Naomi picked up her bag. To think. About us? She did not answer. That silence frightened him more than any argument could have. Trevor followed her toward the car. Naomi! She opened the door, then stopped. Trevor waited. She looked back at him. I'm not trying to punish you. I know. No, I don't think you do. Trevor swallowed. Naomi continued. I'm tired of being hurt and then having to comfort you because you didn't mean to hurt me. He stood still. She got into the car. Trevor watched it pull away. For several minutes he remained outside the building. His first instinct was to call her. Then he imagined Naomi seeing his name on her screen and hearing his voice immediately begin another explanation. He put his phone away. When Trevor finally returned to the apartment, Naomi was already there. She had taken a different ride home, and Trevor had arrived later after spending too much time walking without knowing what to do. The apartment was quiet. Naomi was in the bathroom. Trevor stood in the bedroom doorway. Can we talk? She looked at him through the mirror. Not tonight. Naomi, please. The word was quiet. Trevor stopped. She brushed her teeth, changed into her sleep clothes. Then she got into bed. Trevor remained standing for a moment. He expected her to say something else. She did not. Eventually he turned off the light and lay down beside her. The space between them was no larger than it had ever been, but Trevor could feel the difference. Naomi was not crying, she was not arguing, she was not asking him to understand. She had simply stopped, and lying awake in the darkness beside her, Trevor began to understand something he had never considered before. Naomi's silence was not peace. It was what came after she had spent years trying to be heard. At this point, what do you think Naomi should do? Keep explaining, demand counseling, or walk away before the pattern gets worse? Trevor did not sleep. He lay on his back in the darkness, staring at the ceiling while Naomi breathed quietly beside him. Every few minutes he replayed the rooftop gathering. Not the entire night. One sentence. Honestly, when she gets worked up like that, she's a complete joke. The words sounded different now. At the time, he had expected laughter. He had received some. That had been enough. Trevor had spent years trusting the first reaction in a room. If people laughed, the joke worked. If people smiled, the story landed. If nobody immediately challenged him, he assumed there was nothing serious to examine. But now he remembered what happened after. The laughter had not continued. Naomi had not laughed. She had looked at him. Then she had walked away. Trevor turned his head slightly. Naomi was facing the other direction. He wanted to wake her. He wanted to say something better than what he had said downstairs. But every apology he thought of sounded familiar. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it that way. I was trying to be funny. He understood, at least enough to be afraid, that Naomi had heard those words before. So he said nothing. Sometime before morning, Trevor finally fell asleep. When he woke again, Naomi's side of the bed was empty. For a moment, he thought she was in the bathroom. Then he heard movement in the kitchen. Trevor sat up and checked the time. It was earlier than Naomi normally woke on a Saturday. He pulled on a shirt and walked out. Naomi was standing near the counter with her bag over one shoulder. She looked ready to leave. Trevor stopped. Where are you going? Naomi looked at him. Breakfast. With who? My sister. The answer surprised him. Trevor looked toward the clock. Now? Yes. He waited. Normally, Naomi would have told him about plans like that, not because she needed permission, because that was what they did. They told each other where they were going. They checked whether the other person needed anything. They discussed when they expected to be back. But Naomi had not mentioned breakfast the night before. She had not announced it that morning. She had simply made the plan and gotten ready. Trevor felt the difference immediately. "Oh," he said. Naomi nodded. "I'll be back later." Trevor wanted to ask why she had not told him sooner. Instead, he said, "Okay." She reached for her keys. For a second, he thought she might come over and kiss him goodbye. She did not. "Have a good morning," she said. Then she left. Trevor stood in the kitchen listening to the apartment door close. The silence that followed felt wrong. Not because Naomi had gone out without him. She had done that many times before. Because she had not reached toward him before she left. No complaint, no cold expression, no warning that they needed to talk later. Nothing. Trevor spent the morning moving around the apartment without accomplishing much. He started coffee and forgot about it until it had gone cold. He opened his laptop, stared at his work messages and closed it again. Twice he picked up his phone to call Naomi. Twice he put it down. By late morning he finally sent a message. "Are we going to talk?" He watched the screen. Several minutes passed. Then her reply appeared. "Not yet." Trevor stared at the two words. He typed, "When?" He deleted it. He typed again, "Okay." Then he deleted that too. Eventually he put the phone down without replying. Over the next several days, Naomi was polite. That became the problem. If she had shouted, Trevor would have known where he stood. If she had refused to speak to him, he could have described it as anger. But Naomi answered questions. She went to work. She came home. She handled practical responsibilities. One night she cooked dinner because she had already planned the meal. Another night she ordered food because neither of them wanted to cook. She asked Trevor whether he had paid a bill they had discussed. He asked whether she needed anything from the store. She said no, they functioned. But Trevor began noticing everything that was missing. Naomi no longer reminded him about upcoming birthdays. A few days passed before Trevor remembered he was supposed to respond to an invitation they had received. Normally, Naomi would have mentioned it. She did not. He noticed another friend had recently moved. Naomi had known. Trevor realized she had probably checked in, as she often did, but she had not asked him whether he wanted to send a message too. There were small things everywhere. Plans Naomi quietly followed up on. Dates she remembered. Questions she asked before anyone else thought to ask them. People she checked on. Family matters she kept organized. The invisible work of keeping their shared life connected. Trevor had noticed some of it over the years, but he had treated it like part of the structure of his marriage. Something that would continue because Naomi was Naomi. Now the structure was still standing. But she was no longer carrying all of it for both of them. Trevor felt it in ways he could not explain to anyone else. One evening he came home and noticed there was no plan for dinner. He opened the refrigerator. Nothing was prepared. That should not have mattered. He was an adult. He could cook or order something. But he stood there longer than necessary because he suddenly understood that Naomi had spent years thinking ahead in ways he barely noticed. He had assumed care would always arrive before he needed it. He closed the refrigerator. Naomi was sitting at the table answering something on her laptop. "Do you want to eat?" Trevor asked. She looked up. "I already did." "Oh, there's food if you want it." Trevor nodded. He made himself a plate. Then he sat across from her. Naomi returned to her work. He watched her for a moment. "Are you okay?" "Yes." The answer came too quickly. Trevor waited. Naomi did not add anything. "Are you sure?" She looked up again. "I said I'm okay." He nodded. The conversation ended. Trevor looked down at his food. A few weeks earlier, he might have been relieved. No argument, no long explanation, no tension he had to solve. But now relief was gone. In its place was something much worse. Trevor began wondering whether Naomi was not angry because she was thinking about the things she had once argued about, thinking about how often she had explained them, thinking about whether any of it had changed. And, for the first time, Trevor wondered whether Naomi was asking herself a question he had never seriously considered. Not whether she loved him, whether the marriage still felt emotionally safe enough for her to keep trying. That possibility stayed with him long after Naomi closed her laptop and went to bed. Trevor remained in the living room alone. For years he had believed silence meant the conflict was over. Now he was beginning to understand that silence could mean something else. It could mean the person beside you had stopped believing there was any point in saying the same thing again. Trevor did not expect anyone else to mention the rooftop gathering. He assumed people had gone home, moved on, and returned to their own lives. That was what he wanted to believe. A few days after Naomi left for breakfast with her sister, Trevor received a call from one of his longtime friends. He looked at the phone for several seconds before answering, "Hey, hey." Something about the pause that followed made Trevor sit up straighter. "What's going on?" "Nothing." Trevor waited. Then the friend said, "I just wanted to check on you." Trevor leaned back. "Why?" Another pause. "Because of Friday night." Trevor immediately understood. His stomach tightened. "I'm fine. I wasn't asking whether you were fine." Trevor looked toward the bedroom. Naomi was not home yet. "What did Naomi say?" "Nothing to me." Trevor's voice became sharper. "Then why are you calling?" "I'm not trying to interfere." "It sounds like you are." "I'm calling because that whole thing was uncomfortable." Trevor stood and walked toward the window. There it was. The word he did not want to hear. Uncomfortable. What was uncomfortable? "The story." Trevor laughed once. "Come on. I'm serious. So now I can't tell a joke?" "That's not what I said." Trevor said nothing. The friend continued carefully. "I'm not saying you're a bad husband. I'm saying I don't think that landed the way you thought it did." Trevor felt heat rise into his face. "You all were laughing." "Some people were. That means it was funny." "Does it?" Trevor stared through the window. His first instinct was to answer immediately, but he stopped. The question was irritating because it was simple. He remembered the laughter. He had heard it, but he also remembered what came after. The silence. At the time, he had blamed that silence on Naomi walking away. Now he was less certain. "She knew I was joking," Trevor said. "That's not really the point. It is to me. I know." The answer made Trevor more defensive. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means I think you're still looking at this from the same place." Trevor closed his eyes. He was beginning to hate that sentence. The same place. As though everyone else had suddenly agreed that Trevor had missed something obvious. He forced himself to speak calmly. "So what, you think I'm some kind of terrible person because I told a story?" "No." "Then what are you saying?" "I'm saying you made your wife the punchline in front of a group of people again." Trevor opened his eyes. "Again?" The friend was quiet. Trevor turned away from the window. "What do you mean again?" There was another pause. Then the friend said, "Trevor." Something in that one word made him stop. "How many times do you think you've done it?" Trevor said nothing. The friend did not answer for him. After a few seconds, Trevor said, "I don't know." "Exactly." Trevor ended the call less than a minute later. He told himself he had work to do. He told himself the conversation had been unnecessary. He told himself people were making too much of one bad moment. But irritation stayed with him for the rest of the day. Later that evening, another friend mentioned the rooftop gathering in a message. Trevor almost ignored it. Then he read the message again. Naomi looked really embarrassed. That was all it said. No accusation, no long explanation. Trevor stared at the screen. His immediate reaction was familiar. Embarrassed? Naomi had not looked embarrassed. She had looked angry, hadn't she? Trevor replayed the moment. Naomi looking down at her drink. Naomi saying nothing. Naomi standing still while he told the story. He had assumed she was trying not to react. But what if she had been embarrassed? The thought bothered him, because embarrassment meant something different. Anger could be argued with. Embarrassment meant other people had been involved. Trevor put his phone down. Then he picked it up again. He thought about previous gatherings. At the time, he had never considered them connected. There had been the anniversary story. He remembered Naomi smiling, but now he remembered the smile disappearing when someone asked her if the reservation had really been that bad. Naomi had answered, it wasn't really about the reservation. The conversation had changed after that. Trevor had not thought much about it. There had been the story about the money they were saving. He remembered people laughing at his imitation of Naomi checking their account. But afterward, one person had stopped laughing and said, "Did you guys get that worked out?" Trevor had waved it away. Of course. Naomi had become quiet. There'd been the story about changing the family visit. Trevor remembered Naomi standing beside him while he explained how seriously she took planning. At one point, someone had looked at Naomi and asked, "Is that actually how it happened?" Trevor had answered before she could. "She'll tell you herself. I'm just the victim." Everyone had laughed. Naomi had smiled. He had moved on. Trevor sat down slowly. The memories were not dramatic. That was what made them difficult to face. There had been no major confrontation. No friend had ever taken him aside and called him cruel. No one had said, "Trevor, stop doing this." Instead, there had been smaller signs. Delayed laughter, people changing the subject, questions he answered for Naomi, moments when she became quiet beside him. Trevor had seen some of those things. He had simply refused to look at them for very long. The realization made him uncomfortable because it forced him to consider a truth he did not like. Sometimes not noticing was easier than noticing. If he had recognized Naomi becoming quiet, he might have had to ask why. If he had paid attention to the people who stopped laughing, he might have had to reconsider whether the story was actually harmless. If he had noticed the difference between Naomi smiling and Naomi being comfortable, he might have had to accept that his charm was protecting him from consequences. Not noticing had allowed Trevor to remain the person he believed himself to be, the funny husband, the harmless storyteller, the man who occasionally made mistakes but always meant well. Responsibility became much harder when he considered what Naomi had experienced. That evening, Naomi returned from work and went directly to the bedroom to change. Trevor stood in the hallway. "Naomi?" She looked at him. "What?" He hesitated. "I talked to someone today." "About Friday." Her expression did not change. Trevor continued. "They said the story made people uncomfortable." Naomi nodded once. "That doesn't surprise me." The answer caught him off guard. "You knew?" "I knew some people were uncomfortable." "How?" Naomi looked at him. "Trevor." He understood the answer before she explained it. She had been paying attention the entire time. While he watched the people laughing, Naomi had noticed everyone else. Trevor looked down. Then he asked, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Naomi's face changed slightly. "Tell you what?" "That people noticed." Naomi gave a tired breath. "Because I did tell you." Trevor had no answer. She walked past him. He followed. "Naomi, wait." She stopped but did not turn around. Trevor struggled to find the words. Then he said, "Did someone ever ask you about me?" Naomi was silent. His stomach tightened. "Naomi." She finally turned. "Months ago." Trevor felt his chest grow heavy. "Who?" Naomi shook her head. "I'm not doing that." "Doing what?" "Giving you another name so you can focus on who said something instead of what they were asking." Trevor looked away. "What did you say?" Naomi's voice softened. "I said you were a good man." Trevor looked back at her. She continued, "I said you loved me." He said nothing. "I said you didn't mean to hurt me." Each sentence made him feel worse. Naomi had protected him, privately, while she was already losing trust in him. Trevor had been telling stories that made her look unreasonable, and when someone quietly asked whether she was okay, Naomi had defended him. Not because she was pretending everything was fine, but because she still believed intention mattered. Trevor understood then why criticism from his friends had irritated him. It was easier to dismiss them. Naomi's defense was harder, because it showed how long she had been trying to be fair to him while he was failing to be fair to her. He sat alone in the living room after she went to bed. The rooftop had not created Naomi's silence. It had revealed it. Her withdrawal had started earlier. Her caution had started earlier. The moments she stopped talking had started earlier. Trevor had mistaken all of it for stress, tiredness, work, and ordinary changes in a marriage. Now he understood why Naomi's words downstairs had frightened him. "Nothing you haven't done before." She had not been describing one night. She had been describing a pattern. And Trevor had finally reached the point where he could no longer honestly say he had never seen it. He had seen pieces of it. He simply chose not to put them together. Naomi agreed to talk 3 nights later. Trevor had not asked every day. That had taken effort. His instinct was still to fix things as soon as he understood they were broken. He wanted to ask questions, gather information, and find the sentence that would move them back toward normal. But Naomi had already told him that normal was gone. So he waited. On Wednesday evening, after dinner, Naomi stood at the kitchen counter rinsing her plate. Trevor was in the living room. When she finished, she dried her hands and looked toward him. "Do you still want to talk?" Trevor looked up immediately. "Yes." Naomi nodded. "Okay." She pulled out one of the kitchen chairs and sat down. Trevor followed her to the table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The apartment was quiet, except for the sound of traffic outside. Trevor had imagined this conversation several times. In most versions, he began with a long apology. He had rehearsed explanations about how sorry he was, how embarrassed he felt, and how much he had been thinking about what she said. But now, sitting across from Naomi, the speech felt wrong, too prepared, too focused on him. Naomi waited. Trevor took a breath. "I'm sorry." Naomi looked at him. "For what?" The question stopped him. Trevor had expected her to accept the apology or reject it. He had not expected her to ask him to explain it. "For calling you a joke." Naomi said nothing. Trevor waited. She still said nothing. And suddenly he understood. That was not enough. Not because calling her a joke did not matter. It did. But he had reduced the entire problem to the sentence that finally frightened him, the one everyone had heard, the one he could no longer deny. Trevor looked down at his hands. "For embarrassing you." Naomi remained quiet. He swallowed. "For telling people things you told me privately." Still nothing. Trevor felt his chest tighten. His mind began reaching for individual examples. The anniversary reservation, the money, the family visit, the gathering. But listing them suddenly felt too easy. He had spent years treating each incident as separate, because that allowed him to apologize without changing the part of himself that kept creating the same problem. He looked up. "For making you explain the same hurt over and over because I didn't think I needed to change if I didn't mean to hurt you." Naomi's face changed, only slightly, but Trevor saw it. She leaned back in her chair. For the first time since the conversation began, she looked as though she was considering what he had said rather than waiting for him to stop talking. Trevor continued before he could lose the courage. "I kept thinking my intentions were the answer." Naomi remained silent. "I thought if I loved you and I wasn't trying to embarrass you, then that should matter more than the fact that I embarrassed you." Naomi looked down. Trevor's voice became quieter. "And when you told me you were hurt, I kept acting like I needed to decide whether you had enough reason to be hurt before I had to take responsibility." Naomi slowly folded her hands together. "That is closer." Trevor nodded. He did not feel relieved. He understood now that closer was not forgiveness, it was only accuracy. Naomi looked at him. "Do you know why this feels different?" Trevor shook his head. "Because you're not asking me to make you feel better about me." The words landed hard. Trevor thought about the conversations they had had before. Naomi crying, Naomi explaining, Naomi becoming exhausted, then Trevor apologizing until she softened. He had always believed the softening meant the problem had been resolved. But sometimes, Naomi had probably been comforting him. Sometimes his guilt had become another responsibility for her to manage. Trevor looked away. "I didn't realize I was doing that." "I know." He looked back at her. The answer hurt more than anger. Naomi continued, "That's part of why I'm tired." Trevor nodded slowly. He wanted to tell her he understood. But he knew better now than to claim understanding too quickly, so he waited. Naomi spoke again. "Every time I brought something up, you would become upset when you realized I was hurt." Trevor listened. "Then I would explain that I knew you didn't mean it." He felt his stomach drop. "And then you would apologize." Naomi paused. "Then eventually I would calm you down." Trevor could not answer. "Do you see what happened?" "Yes." His voice was quiet. "You got hurt," Naomi said, "and somehow I still ended up taking care of you." Trevor nodded. "I'm sorry." Naomi looked at him. He stopped himself. The apology had become automatic. Not false, but automatic. Naomi noticed. "That's what I mean." Trevor leaned back. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Then he asked, "What do you need from me?" Naomi thought about the question. "I don't know yet." Trevor nodded. The answer frightened him. He had expected something practical, counseling, a promise, a rule about what he could and could not share, a plan. But Naomi was not ready to give him a plan. That meant she was still deciding whether she wanted one. Trevor looked at the table. Then he asked the question he had been avoiding. "Are you thinking about leaving?" Naomi looked directly at him. "I don't know." Trevor felt the answer move through him slowly. Not a threat, not a warning, not something she said to make him panic. She genuinely did not know. He saw it in her face. Naomi was not standing on one side of a decision, waiting for Trevor to say the right thing. She was uncertain. Trevor had spent the past few days trying to understand what he could do to make her stay. But sitting across from her, he understood that he could not ask her to decide before he had done the work of changing. Naomi looked down. "I love you." Trevor's eyes lifted. "But I'm tired of feeling like I have to shrink my feelings so you can stay comfortable." He said nothing. "I don't want to keep wondering whether I can tell my husband something without hearing it later in front of other people." Trevor swallowed. "I understand." Naomi looked at him. He corrected himself. "No, I'm starting to understand." That time Naomi did not object. Trevor continued. "I don't know how much trust you have left in me." Naomi's expression tightened. "I don't know either." He nodded. The honesty of that answer left no room for him to defend himself. For years he had assumed the marriage would survive because they loved each other. He had never seriously considered that love could continue while trust weakened. He had never understood how someone could remain beside you, defend you, cook dinner with you, attend gatherings with you, and quietly become less willing to place vulnerable parts of themselves in your hands. Now he did. Trevor looked at Naomi. "I don't want to lose you." Naomi said nothing. He continued, "But I know saying that doesn't fix anything." "No," Trevor nodded. "And I'm not asking you to tell me you're staying." Naomi looked at him more carefully. He felt the fear of those words, but he meant them. "I want to change whether you forgive me quickly or not." For the first time that evening, Naomi's eyes softened, only slightly. Trevor noticed but did not reach for it. He had spent too many years treating small moments of warmth as permission to stop examining himself. So he remained where he was. Naomi stood from the table. Trevor did not follow. She picked up her glass and walked toward the sink. Then she stopped. "Trevor." "Yes?" She turned. "If you change, don't change so I'll stop being upset." He waited. "Change because you finally understand that you should have listened before I had to leave a room to get your attention." Trevor looked at her. The words were difficult to hear because they were true. He nodded once. "I will." Naomi turned back toward the sink. Trevor remained at the kitchen table. He had apologized, but for the first time the apology had not given him relief. It had given him a responsibility. And sitting there alone after Naomi went to bed, Trevor finally faced the consequence he had avoided for years. He might not lose his marriage because of one joke. He might lose it because the joke had revealed something Naomi already believed. That explaining herself had not changed him, and until Trevor proved otherwise, he had no right to ask her to keep trying. The morning after their conversation at the kitchen table, Trevor woke with an unfamiliar kind of hope. Not relief. He knew better than to call it that. Naomi had not forgiven him. She had not said they were going to be okay. She had not reached across the table and told him she was willing to start over. But she had agreed to talk. She had listened. And somewhere inside Trevor, a part of him immediately wanted to believe that meant the worst had passed. That realization embarrassed him. He was standing in the bathroom brushing his teeth when Naomi walked past the open door on her way to the kitchen. Trevor looked at her reflection in the mirror. For half a second he considered saying something. "Good morning. I'm glad we talked. I feel better after last night." Then he stopped. "I feel better." The thought exposed the problem immediately. Naomi had spent the previous evening telling him that his apologies had often ended with her managing his emotional response. If he began the next morning by asking her to respond to his hope, he would be doing it again. Trevor finished brushing his teeth and went into the kitchen. "Morning," he said. "Morning." Naomi was making coffee. Trevor leaned against the counter. She looked tired, not angry, not warm, just tired. He wanted to ask how she felt after their conversation. Instead, he asked, "Do you want me to make breakfast?" Naomi looked at him. "I already have something." "Okay." Trevor opened the refrigerator and stood there. The silence made him uncomfortable. He closed the door. Naomi picked up her coffee. "I'm going to get ready for work." "Okay." She walked away. Trevor remained in the kitchen. Nothing had been repaired overnight. That was the first thing he had to accept. Over the next few days, he became aware of how often he wanted reassurance without admitting it. He wanted Naomi to laugh at something he said. He wanted her to initiate a conversation. He wanted her to touch his arm when she walked past him. When she did none of those things, he felt rejected. Then he had to confront another uncomfortable truth. Naomi was not rejecting him by refusing to comfort him. She was simply no longer pretending that everything felt normal. One evening, Trevor tried to apologize again. Naomi was sitting on the couch reading something on her phone while he stood near the window. "I've been thinking about what you said." Naomi looked up. Trevor nodded. "I just want you to know how bad I feel about everything." The words left his mouth, and he immediately saw Naomi's expression change. Not dramatically, but enough. "What?" he asked. Naomi put her phone down. "Why are you telling me that?" Trevor frowned. "Because I want you to know I'm sorry." "You already told me you were sorry." "I know. Then what do you need from me right now?" Trevor opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Naomi waited. He finally understood. He had not come over to apologize. Not entirely. He had come because sitting alone with his guilt was uncomfortable. Some part of him wanted Naomi to see how much he was suffering so she could reassure him that he was not the terrible person he feared becoming. His face tightened. "I don't know." Naomi nodded slowly. "That's what I mean." Trevor felt irritation rise before he could stop it. So I can't apologize now? Naomi looked at him. I didn't say that. It feels like everything I say is wrong. The moment the sentence left his mouth, Trevor knew. Naomi stared at him. He felt himself becoming defensive. Again. The old habit arrived quickly. He wanted to explain that he was trying. He wanted Naomi to acknowledge how difficult this was for him. He wanted to argue that she was making every conversation impossible. Then he stopped. Trevor looked away. I'm doing it again. Naomi remained quiet. He sat down on the opposite end of the couch. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Trevor said, I came over here because I felt guilty. Naomi listened. And I wanted you to make that feeling smaller. Her face softened slightly. Trevor continued, I'm sorry for putting that on you. Naomi did not tell him it was okay. This time, Trevor did not wait for her to. The next change was harder to notice at first. It happened inside his own head. Trevor had always been a storyteller. At work, with friends, at dinners, he naturally searched for the entertaining angle in ordinary situations. He could turn a delayed flight into a funny disaster. He could tell a story about a failed presentation and have people laughing at the right moment. He had never believed humor itself was a problem. Now he began asking himself a question before speaking. Is this mine to tell? The question followed him into conversations. At first he hated it. It made him feel overly cautious. He would begin telling a story and suddenly stop to consider who else was inside it. Was the embarrassing detail his to share? Had the person told him this in confidence? Was he about to turn someone else's reaction into the funniest part because it would make the story work better? Trevor began noticing how often Naomi's reactions had served that purpose. He had not consciously thought, Naomi will be the target. The process had been more automatic. A disagreement happened. Naomi responded emotionally. Trevor later remembered the response because it was expressive. Then, in a social setting, he shaped the memory around the response. By the end, the original disagreement had become a story about Naomi. That realization disturbed him because the habit was so ordinary to him. Recognizing it did not erase it. Sometimes he caught himself before he spoke. Other times, he caught himself after the first sentence. Once, while talking about a work problem, Trevor began describing how Naomi had reacted when he complained about it at home. He stopped in the middle of the story. The people around him waited. Trevor changed the subject. Nobody noticed anything unusual, but he did. That night he told Naomi what had happened. She was washing dishes. Trevor stood beside the counter. I almost told a story about you today. Naomi looked at him. Okay. I stopped. She returned to the dish in her hands. Trevor waited. Naomi finally said, How did you feel? The question surprised him. Strange. Why? Because it used to be automatic. Naomi nodded. That's probably the point. Trevor thought about that after she went to bed. Change, he realized, was not going to feel dramatic most of the time. There would be no audience, no applause. No one would congratulate him for deciding not to repeat a private story. He would simply have to stop doing things that once came easily. Naomi also began setting clearer boundaries. One night she told him directly that she did not want their private disagreements discussed with other people unless they both agreed to it. Trevor immediately said, Of course. Naomi looked at him. What? You said that too quickly. Trevor sighed. I agree with you. I know, but I want you to understand what I mean. The old frustration moved through him. He almost said, I do understand. Instead, he waited. Naomi continued, I'm not saying you can never talk about our marriage. Trevor listened. I'm saying you don't get to turn my vulnerable moments into material without my consent. The word consent made him uncomfortable, not because he disagreed, because it made the issue clearer than he wanted it to be. He had treated private information as something shared automatically by marriage. Naomi was telling him that intimacy did not erase ownership over personal experiences. Trevor nodded. I understand. Naomi studied him. Then he corrected himself. I understand what you're saying. I may still have to learn how to live it. That answer felt more honest. Naomi nodded once. Okay. Trevor went to bed that night without knowing whether she trusted him any more than she had the week before, and for the first time he accepted that he might not get to know. He could change and still receive no immediate reassurance. He could make better choices and still feel uncertain. He could remain uncomfortable without asking Naomi to make him comfortable. That, Trevor was beginning to understand, was part of accountability, changing his behavior even when nobody was there to reward him for it. The first real test came sooner than Trevor expected. It was a family gathering on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of event he would normally attend without thinking much about how he behaved once he got there. Naomi almost did not go. Trevor noticed her hesitation while she stood in the bedroom deciding what to wear. "You don't have to come," he said. Naomi looked at him through the mirror. "I know. You can stay home if you want." She gave a small nod. For a moment, Trevor thought she might take him up on it. Instead, she said, "I'll go." He did not ask whether she was going for him. He had learned enough to understand that not every silence needed to be questioned immediately, so they went. The gathering was ordinary. People ate, talked, moved between rooms and complained about work. Someone discussed rising expenses. Another person talked about a trip they were planning. There were conversations about relationships, responsibilities, and the strange ways adult life seemed to become more complicated every year. Trevor was quieter than usual at first, not silent, just more aware. He noticed how easily conversation could create an opening for a story. Someone mentioned being late to an event. Trevor remembered arriving late to one of Naomi's family gatherings. The memory appeared in his mind with the shape of a familiar story. He could already hear the opening line. He had been stuck in traffic. Naomi had been waiting. By the time he arrived, she had been standing near the door with that look on her face. The story would be easy. He could imitate the way she had spoken. People would laugh. Trevor felt the old instinct move through him. Then the question appeared. Is this mine to tell? He almost ignored it. The disagreement had happened to him too. That was what he would once have said. But he remembered Naomi sitting across from him at the kitchen table. "You don't get to turn my vulnerable moments into material without my consent." Trevor stayed quiet. A few minutes later, someone asked Naomi a question about a situation at work. Naomi answered briefly. Trevor knew more about it. She had told him about the difficult parts privately. He also knew the detail that would make the story funny. He felt himself preparing to add it. Then he stopped. Naomi had told him that detail at home, not for an audience. Trevor took a drink instead. The conversation moved on. No one noticed. But Naomi did. He could tell. She looked at him for half a second. Trevor looked away. Later, another conversation began about marriage. Trevor felt himself relax. This was familiar territory. Someone joked about partners forgetting things they had promised to do. Trevor laughed. Then he said, "That reminds me of—" He stopped. Several people looked at him. Trevor had already begun. The old story was waiting. This time the moment was worse, because stopping halfway made the silence obvious. For a second he considered continuing anyway. It would have been easier. Just finish the story, make everyone laugh, get through the awkwardness. Instead, Trevor shook his head. "Actually, never mind." There was a brief pause. Someone smiled uncertainly. Trevor felt his face warm. He could have rescued the moment with another joke. He could have laughed at himself. He could have invented a different ending. But he had spent enough time thinking about his behavior to recognize another habit. Whenever something became uncomfortable, he tried to entertain his way out of it. Not this time. He simply let the moment be awkward. Then someone changed the subject. The conversation continued. Trevor sat there with the discomfort. Naomi said nothing. On the drive home, neither of them mentioned it immediately. Trevor kept his eyes on the road. He thought about the moment again. Part of him wanted Naomi to praise him. He had stopped. He had caught himself. Wasn't that proof that he was changing? The thought embarrassed him almost as soon as it appeared. Stopping himself once did not erase years of doing the opposite. They arrived at the apartment. Naomi put her bag down. Trevor followed her into the kitchen. "I almost did it again." Naomi turned toward him. "I noticed." Trevor nodded. "I started the story." "Yes." "And then I stopped." "Yes." He waited. Naomi leaned against the counter. Trevor understood that she was waiting for him to say more. It felt strange, he admitted. Naomi remained quiet. "I knew where the story was going. What would have happened if you'd finished it?" Trevor looked down. "You would have become the funny part." Naomi nodded. Trevor continued. "And I didn't even notice that at first. I just thought the story was funny. That's why understanding the problem and changing the behavior aren't the same thing." Trevor looked at her. The sentence could have made him defensive. A few weeks earlier, it probably would have. Instead, he nodded. "You're right." Naomi crossed her arms. "Stopping once doesn't mean you won't do it again." "I know. You might." Trevor waited. "I probably will have moments where I almost do." Naomi studied him. "And then what?" Trevor thought about it. "I stop. Even if it's awkward." "Yes." "Even if people think you're strange." "Yes." "Even if I'm not there?" Trevor looked at her. Yes. That last answer mattered. He could see that it did. Naomi looked away. Trevor continued, I can't ask you to trust a promise. I can only give you something different to experience. Naomi was quiet. The words had come from what they had discussed before, but Trevor did not say them to impress her. He understood them now. Trust was not a decision Naomi could make because he wanted it. She could not simply wake up one morning and choose to feel safe with him again. Her experience would have to change first, and it would have to change repeatedly, over time, without Trevor demanding credit for every better decision. Naomi finally said, That's true. Trevor nodded. There was no celebration, no sudden closeness. She went to change clothes. Trevor remained in the kitchen, but something had changed inside him. For the first time, he understood that being funny was not the problem. He did not need to become serious. He did not need to stop telling stories. Humor had never been the enemy. The problem was what he had been willing to use. He had treated Naomi's frustration, embarrassment, and vulnerability as available material because he knew how to make those moments entertaining. He had protected himself inside the story. He had made her response larger and his own behavior smaller. That night, Trevor received a call from someone who had attended the gathering. The conversation was casual. Eventually, Trevor mentioned a mistake he had made at work. Normally, he would have searched for a way to include Naomi. He might have described what she said when he told her about it. He might have imitated her voice. This time, he did something different. He told the story exactly as it happened. He had made the mistake. He had ignored an obvious detail. He had created extra work for himself. He described how confidently he had believed he was right before realizing he had misunderstood the situation completely. The person on the other end laughed. Trevor laughed too, and for once he did not feel the need to redirect the embarrassment. He let himself be the foolish one. The story was still funny, maybe even funnier because he was not trying to protect his image. When the call ended, Trevor sat on the couch for a while. Naomi was reading in the bedroom. He did not go in to tell her what he had done. He did not ask whether she had noticed he was changing. He did not look for reassurance. The decision was too small to announce. That was the point. He had spent years making private moments public. Now he was beginning to understand the value of keeping some things inside himself. Not every realization needed an audience. Not every better choice needed to be witnessed. Sometimes change was simply deciding to stop when the old version of you wanted to continue, and then continuing your life without asking anyone to congratulate you for it. The changes Trevor was making did not immediately make Naomi feel safe. That was one of the hardest things for both of them to accept. Trevor was beginning to listen more carefully. He was catching himself before telling stories that were not fully his to tell. He was no longer demanding that Naomi reassure him after every difficult conversation. Those changes mattered. But Naomi did not suddenly feel lighter. In some ways, she felt more tired. Because now that Trevor was finally becoming willing to listen, she had to decide what she had actually wanted to say all those years. For a long time, Naomi had believed she had been clear. She had told Trevor when he embarrassed her. She had told him when his stories hurt. She had explained why intention did not erase impact. But she also began noticing something uncomfortable about herself. She had often laughed when she was hurt. At gatherings, when Trevor told a story she did not like, Naomi sometimes smiled because everyone else was smiling. She did not want to become the person who interrupted the room. She did not want people to look at her as though she could not take a joke. She did not want Trevor to become embarrassed and then accuse her of making the moment uncomfortable, so she laughed, or smiled, or stayed quiet. Later, when they were alone, she explained why she had been hurt. Trevor would apologize. Eventually the tension would settle, and life would continue. Naomi had spent years mistaking restored peace for resolved pain. One evening she was sitting at the kitchen table when Trevor came home. He put his keys down and looked toward her. Hey. Trevor opened the refrigerator. Naomi watched him for a moment. Then she said, I need to tell you something. He closed the refrigerator door. Okay. Trevor sat across from her. Naomi looked down at her hands. I've been thinking about why this went on for so long. Trevor remained quiet. And I need to be honest about something. His face tightened slightly. Naomi noticed. What? Nothing. Keep going. She gave a small breath. I avoided confrontation. Trevor said nothing. I told you when things hurt me, but I didn't always say it as clearly as I should have. Trevor leaned forward. Naomi held up her hand. Let me finish. He leaned back immediately. I laughed when I didn't think something was funny. Trevor listened. Apologies because I wanted the argument to end. Naomi paused. And sometimes, when you did something again, I was already so tired that I acted like it wasn't worth bringing up. Trevor looked down. Naomi continued. I thought I was keeping the peace. The words were difficult to say. But I think sometimes I was protecting the routine. Trevor looked back at her. Naomi saw something move across his face. Relief, small, quick, but there. She understood immediately what he was thinking, that both of them were responsible, that the problem belonged equally to both of them. Trevor began to speak. So maybe... No. He stopped. Naomi sat back. This does not make what you did less serious. Trevor nodded quickly. I know. Do you? He waited. Naomi continued. I'm not saying I caused you to tell stories about me. No. I'm not saying I made you humiliate me. No. I'm saying I had my own reasons for staying quiet after it happened. Trevor listened carefully. And I need to understand those reasons because I don't want to keep repeating them. The room became quiet. Trevor nodded. That makes sense. Naomi watched him. You don't have to say anything else. He looked down again. I was going to say I understand. Naomi gave a small smile. Trevor noticed. I know, she said. The smile disappeared quickly, but not coldly. Naomi looked toward the window. For a long time, I thought being patient was always the better choice. Trevor remained still. I thought if I explained myself calmly enough, you would understand. She paused. And when you didn't, I thought maybe I needed to explain it better. Trevor's face changed. Naomi continued. So I explained. Her voice remained quiet. Then you apologized. She looked at him. Then I accepted the apology. Trevor swallowed. Then things went back to normal. Naomi nodded. Until the next time. Neither of them spoke. The pattern sounded simple when she described it that way. One person avoided accountability. Another avoided a confrontation that might disrupt the relationship. Both returned to the routine. Then both repeated it. Naomi had not created Trevor's behavior, but her desire for peace had helped make the pattern easier to survive. At least temporarily, and because it was survivable, it continued. Trevor finally said, I thought you accepting my apology meant we were okay. I know. I didn't think you were still carrying it. I wasn't carrying every individual argument. Trevor looked confused. Naomi tried to find the right words. I was carrying what they taught me. He remained silent. Every time I explained something and nothing changed, I trusted you a little less with the next thing. Trevor lowered his eyes. So eventually, Naomi continued, I stopped giving you as much. The words brought him back to everything he had noticed after the rooftop. The missing conversations, the plans she no longer discussed, the private thoughts she had stopped sharing. Trevor had assumed Naomi was stressed, but she had been adapting, protecting herself. He looked at her. Why didn't you tell me you were doing that? Naomi stared at him. Trevor immediately closed his mouth. She raised her eyebrows. Sorry, he nodded. That was the wrong question. Naomi waited. Trevor tried again. What stopped you from telling me? Naomi considered the difference. Then she answered. Because by then I didn't believe explaining would change anything. Trevor leaned back. He did not defend himself. Naomi noticed. The old Trevor might have asked for examples. He might have reminded her that he had apologized. He might have argued that she should have told him before reaching that point. This time he simply listened. Naomi continued. I also didn't want to disrupt my own life. Trevor looked at her. We had routines, friends, family expectations, a home. She looked around the apartment. It was easier to tell myself that the problem wasn't serious enough to question everything. Trevor's expression tightened. Naomi continued. That doesn't mean I was happy, he nodded. It means leaving a pattern is difficult when the pattern is mixed with ordinary life. Trevor said nothing. Naomi looked down. I think I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped trying to keep everything smooth. Trevor's voice was quiet. And now? Now I know what happens. He looked at her. Naomi met his eyes. Everything changes. The words remained between them. Trevor wanted to say that he could make things better, but Naomi had not asked him to. She had said something else. She had finally stopped protecting the appearance of peace. Over the following days, Naomi began practicing a different kind of honesty. Not dramatic honesty, direct honesty. When Trevor asked whether she wanted to attend something, Naomi stopped automatically saying yes. Sometimes the answer was no. When he asked whether she was okay, she sometimes said, I don't want to talk about that yet. Instead of pretending everything was fine, She began telling him when she was uncomfortable, without immediately explaining it for 20 minutes. One night, Trevor was telling her about something that had happened at work. Halfway through, he said something that bothered Naomi. She interrupted him. "I don't like how you're describing that." Trevor stopped. His face tightened. Naomi saw the defensive reaction arrive. She waited. He took a breath. "What part?" she explained. Trevor listened. Then he nodded. "Okay." That was all. Naomi looked at him. "Okay?" "I don't agree that I meant it the way you heard it." Her expression changed. Trevor continued quickly. "But I heard what bothered you." Naomi remained still. "I need to think about that before I keep talking." It was not a perfect response, but it was different. Trevor did not force her to prove that her discomfort was reasonable before he allowed it to exist. He could disagree with her interpretation without denying her experience. Naomi understood that this was what listening would have to look like if they continued. Not surrender, not pretending they would never misunderstand each other, but making room for the possibility that one person could cause harm without intending it. Weeks earlier, Trevor would have heard Naomi's reaction as an accusation. Now he was beginning to hear it as information. Naomi had work to do as well. She had to stop waiting until something happened 5 times before deciding it mattered. She had to stop laughing when she wanted to say, "I don't like that." She had to accept that clear boundaries might create uncomfortable moments, and that discomfort did not automatically mean she had done something wrong. One evening they returned to the kitchen table where they had first spoken honestly. Naomi sat down. Trevor joined her. She looked directly at him. "There's something I need you to understand." Trevor nodded. Naomi took a breath. "Staying in this marriage is not something you should assume anymore." His face became still. She continued before he could speak. "I'm not saying that to scare you. I know. I'm saying it because I need to stop living as though leaving is impossible just because leaving would be difficult." Trevor looked at the table. Naomi's voice remained calm. "If I stay, it has to be because this relationship becomes different." Trevor nodded. "Not because I'm afraid to disrupt my life." He looked up at her. "And if you decide you can't stay?" Naomi held his gaze. "I'm not failing you." Trevor felt the words deeply. He wanted to say that she would never fail him, but the truth was more complicated. If she left, part of him would probably feel abandoned, even if he understood why. Naomi was asking him to prepare himself for that possibility without turning his pain into a reason she had to remain. Trevor nodded slowly. "You're not failing me." Naomi watched him. He continued, "And I don't want you to stay because you're afraid of what changing your life would cost." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Naomi looked down. Trevor did not reach across the table. He did not ask whether that meant she was still thinking of leaving. He did not ask how close she was to a decision. He simply allowed the truth to remain there. Naomi finally looked back at him. This time, Trevor understood that their marriage was no longer being carried by habit. And perhaps that was the first honest thing about it in a long time. Whatever happened next would have to be chosen, not assumed. The first few weeks after Naomi told Trevor that staying in the marriage was no longer something he should assume were difficult in ways neither of them expected. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no slammed doors, no packed suitcases waiting by the entrance, no final decision made during an argument. Instead, life continued. Trevor went to work. Naomi went to work. Bills still had to be paid. Groceries still had to be bought. Laundry still collected on chairs before either of them finally put it away. But the ordinary parts of their lives no longer allowed either of them to hide inside routine. That was the difference. Before, a peaceful week could make Trevor believe a problem had disappeared. Now he knew better. A peaceful week might simply mean Naomi had not encountered the same behavior. It might mean nothing at all. So he stopped treating the absence of conflict as proof that he had changed. Weeks became months. The changes were not perfectly steady. Trevor still had moments when his first instinct was to defend himself. Sometimes Naomi would tell him something he had done that bothered her, and he would feel the explanation forming before she finished speaking. But he became better at noticing that moment. He would stop, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes after he had already started defending himself. One evening, Naomi came home later than usual. Trevor was making dinner. She placed her work bag near the kitchen counter and sat down heavily. Trevor looked over his shoulder. "Long day?" Naomi gave a tired laugh. "You could say that." Trevor turned the heat down and waited. A few months earlier, Naomi might have said she was fine. She might have kept the details to herself, but she began talking. not all at once. First, she complained about a meeting that had taken longer than it should have. Then she explained that she had spent most of the afternoon correcting a problem she had not created. Trevor listened while finishing dinner. Naomi became more animated as she continued. By the time she reached the most frustrating part, she was standing beside the counter, moving her hands as she described what had happened. Trevor recognized something important. This was the kind of story he once would have remembered, not because of what had happened at Naomi's work, but because of how Naomi was reacting now. He might have repeated her words later. He might have copied the expression on her face. He might have turned the whole thing into a story about his serious, organized wife finally losing patience. The thought appeared, then disappeared. Not because Trevor had forgotten how to tell that kind of story, because he understood that Naomi was talking to him. She was not creating material for him. When she finished, Trevor asked, "What do you need from me?" Naomi looked surprised. "What do you mean? Do you want me to tell you what I think, or do you just want to be annoyed about it for a while?" Naomi stared at him. Then she laughed. A real laugh. Trevor smiled. "Those are different things." "I know." "So," Naomi thought about it, "I just want to be annoyed about it for a while." "Okay," Trevor nodded. "That sounds reasonable." Naomi continued talking. He listened, and when the evening was over, the story stayed inside their apartment. It was such a small thing that Trevor almost did not think about it again, but Naomi did. A few days later, she was talking to him about something else when she suddenly stopped. Trevor looked at her. "What?" Naomi shook her head. "Nothing." He waited. Naomi gave a small, uncertain smile. "I forgot for a second." "Forgot what?" She looked at him. "That I was telling you something personal." Trevor remained quiet. Naomi seemed to regret saying it. I know that sounds strange." "It doesn't." She looked down. "I used to think about what I could tell you." Trevor felt the words settle heavily, not dramatically, quietly, like something he had known in theory but had never fully understood in practice. Naomi continued, "I would be talking and part of me would wonder if I was giving you a story." Trevor did not interrupt. "But lately I haven't been thinking about that as much." She looked uncomfortable. "Sometimes I still do." "I know." Naomi nodded. "But I didn't tonight." Trevor wanted to apologize. He almost did. Instead, he said, "Thank you for telling me." Naomi looked at him. Then she nodded. That was all. Trust, Trevor was learning, did not always announce its return. Sometimes it appeared in a sentence that almost went unnoticed. Sometimes it appeared when Naomi started speaking without preparing herself first. Sometimes it appeared when she complained freely and only later realized she had not been protecting the details. Their first real disagreement after the rooftop happened over something completely ordinary. Trevor had agreed to handle an errand after work. Naomi had planned her own evening around it. He forgot. When Naomi asked about it, Trevor remembered immediately. His stomach dropped. "I forgot." Naomi looked at him. "Yes, I'm sorry." She crossed her arms. Trevor recognized the expression, not the expression itself, the old instinct it triggered in him. He wanted to explain that work had been busy. He wanted to remind her that he had been trying. He wanted her to remember all the other times he had followed through recently. Then he stopped. The other good things did not cancel the fact that he had forgotten. "I should have put it on my calendar," he said. Naomi looked at him. "I reminded you yesterday." "You did. And this morning, you did." Trevor nodded. Naomi waited. He could feel how easily this could become a conversation about whether she was overreacting. The old Trevor would have argued that everyone forgot things sometimes. He might have asked why she was making one mistake so serious. Instead, he said, "I understand why you're upset." Naomi remained still. Trevor continued, "You planned around me doing it." "Yes." "And now you have to change your plans because I didn't do what I said I would." "Yes," Trevor nodded. "I'm going to handle it now." Naomi watched him. He picked up his keys, then she said, "Trevor." He stopped. "What? You're not going to explain?" He looked at her. "I was busy." Naomi raised her eyebrows. Trevor gave a small smile. And being busy doesn't mean I didn't forget." Something in Naomi's face changed. She stepped aside. Trevor left to handle the errand. He did not know whether the disagreement was resolved. He did not need to know yet. When he returned, Naomi was on the couch. They talked. Not for hours. Not in circles. Naomi told him that what bothered her most was the uncertainty of whether she could rely on him after he promised something. Trevor listened. Then he apologized once, clearly, without adding an explanation afterward. The next day he went to work. He spoke to people, he had lunch, he came home, and he did not tell anyone about the disagreement. That was important too. Not because Naomi had demanded secrecy about every disagreement, but because Trevor no longer needed an audience to help him process his discomfort. He could sit with the fact that he had disappointed her. He could learn from it. He could make a better choice next time. Without reshaping Naomi's reaction into an entertaining story that made him feel less responsible. Months passed. Naomi still had moments of caution. Sometimes she would pause in the middle of a story and look at Trevor as though checking herself. Sometimes she would ask, "You're not going to tell anyone this, right?" Trevor never became offended by the question. He understood why it existed. "No," he would say, and he would mean it. Other times Naomi told him something and never asked. Those moments mattered even more. Trevor noticed that he was no longer counting them. He was not keeping score. He was not thinking, "She trusted me today." He simply listened. One night, Naomi sat beside him on the couch and told him about a difficult situation involving her family. It was deeply personal. Trevor knew that. He listened carefully. When she finished, Naomi rested her head against the back of the couch. The room was quiet. Trevor looked toward her. "Are you okay?" Naomi thought about it. "Not really." He nodded. "I'm here." Naomi closed her eyes. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Naomi opened her eyes again. A strange expression crossed her face. Trevor noticed. "What?" Naomi looked at him. "I just told you all of that." "Yes. And I didn't wonder whether I was going to hear strangers laughing about it later." Trevor said nothing. Naomi looked away. The realization seemed to affect her more than she expected. Her eyes became wet, but she did not cry. Trevor remained beside her. He did not turn the moment into an apology. He did not ask her to forgive him. He did not tell her that she could trust him now. He understood that she had reached the conclusion on her own. Naomi had told him something personal. She had spoken freely, and afterwards she had not been afraid of what would happen to her words. That realization affected Trevor deeply too, but he kept it to himself. He simply sat beside her, because sometimes the most important change was not saying anything at all. By the time Naomi and Trevor attended another gathering with some of the people from the Midtown rooftop night, nearly 5 months had passed. The invitation had made Naomi hesitate. Trevor noticed the moment she read it. They were sitting at opposite ends of the couch when she lowered her phone. "You don't want to go?" Naomi looked at him. "I didn't say that." "No," Trevor nodded. "But you look like you were deciding whether it was worth it." Naomi gave him a small look. "Was that supposed to be funny?" "No." "Good," Trevor smiled. Naomi looked back at the invitation. "I don't know. You don't have to go." "I know." The answer was familiar now. Trevor had learned not to argue with it. For years he had often responded to Naomi's hesitation by persuading her to make the choice that felt easiest for him. If people asked where she was, he felt awkward. If she skipped an event, he worried they would think something was wrong. Now he understood that Naomi did not owe his social life her presence. After a few minutes she said, "I think I'll go." Trevor looked at her. "Okay. That's all? What else should I say?" "I don't know." Trevor shrugged. "You decided." Naomi stared at him for a second. Then she laughed softly. "Amazing." "What?" "Nothing." He knew what she meant. Once he would have asked why she was making it so complicated. Now he simply picked up his phone. The gathering was held in a different part of the city, but the atmosphere was familiar. Food covered a long table. Music played quietly enough for conversations to continue without people shouting. Small groups formed and changed throughout the evening. Some of the same people from the rooftop night were there. Trevor noticed them. So did Naomi. Neither of them said anything about it. At first Naomi stayed close to Trevor, not because she needed protection, because entering the room brought back memories she had not expected. Trevor noticed her hand briefly tighten around the strap of her bag. "Want to leave?" Naomi looked at him. "We just got here." "That doesn't answer the question." She considered it. "No." "Okay." Trevor did not ask again. Gradually, Naomi began talking to people. Trevor did the same. The evening became easier. Not because the past had disappeared, because nobody was forcing it to dominate every conversation. Later, Trevor was standing with a small group when someone mentioned a story he used to tell. It was an old disagreement between him and Naomi. Trevor remembered it immediately. So did Naomi. He could see it from where she stood nearby. Someone laughed. "Tell that story again." Another person agreed. "Oh, I remember that one." Trevor smiled. The familiar instinct appeared. The opening was right there. He knew the timing. He knew which details would make people laugh. He knew exactly when he used to imitate Naomi. For years he would have started automatically. Instead, Trevor looked toward Naomi, then back at the group. I probably shouldn't tell that one. The people around him waited. Trevor smiled. Naomi gets to decide whether that story leaves the house. A few people laughed. Naomi looked at him. Trevor did not look back at her for approval. He simply took another drink and continued the conversation. Someone brought up a different topic. That was it. No speech, no explanation, no public announcement about how much he had changed. Trevor had learned that even growth could become a performance if he was not careful. He could have used the moment to explain himself. He could have told everyone that Naomi had taught him an important lesson. He could have made the room admire his self-awareness. But the old problem had been his willingness to turn Naomi's private experience into something useful for himself. He was not going to turn his improvement into another version of the same behavior. Naomi continued talking with someone nearby, but something had shifted inside her. Trevor could tell later, not because she praised him, because she relaxed, only slightly. The evening continued. Trevor made people laugh several times. He told stories about himself. He joked about mistakes he had made at work. He described getting lost while trying to find a meeting location and confidently walking in the wrong direction for several minutes before realizing nobody was following him. People laughed. Trevor laughed too. Naomi watched him from across the room. There was something she had once feared losing if Trevor changed. His humor, the quality that had first attracted her to him, but it was still there. The difference was where the joke landed. He did not need her embarrassment to make himself interesting. When the gathering began to wind down, Naomi went outside for some air. One of Trevor's longtime friends followed her. Trevor noticed but did not interrupt. He knew that friend had once privately asked Naomi whether she was okay. Months earlier, discovering that had hurt his pride. Now he understood why the question had been asked. A few minutes later, Trevor stepped outside himself. Naomi was gone. She had returned inside. The friend remained near the railing. Trevor stood beside him. For a moment, they looked out over the city. Then Trevor said, "I owe you an apology too." The friend looked at him. "For what?" "For getting defensive when you told me the truth." The friend was quiet. Trevor continued, "You were trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. You were upset. I was protecting myself." The friend gave a small nod. Trevor looked toward the street below. "Naomi told you she was okay, didn't she?" The friend did not answer immediately. Trevor understood that the question was not his to press. Then the friend said, "She never told me you were trying to hurt her." Trevor looked at him. The friend continued, "She said something once." Trevor waited. "She said, 'I don't think he's trying to hurt me. I just don't know if he'll ever think it matters enough to stop.'" Trevor became completely still. The noise from inside seemed farther away. He looked toward the windows. Naomi was visible through the glass, talking with someone. For a moment, Trevor could not move. The sentence explained something he had failed to understand for years. Naomi had believed he loved her. That had never been the deepest question. She had not spent years wondering whether Trevor woke up wanting to hurt her. The problem was worse in a quieter way. She had wondered whether her pain could ever outweigh his need to be liked, his need for a laugh, his need to be the person with the best story, his need to keep the room entertained. Trevor remembered every time he had defended himself with the same argument. "I was joking. I didn't mean it that way. You know I love you." All of it had answered the wrong question. Naomi had not needed him to prove that he loved her. She had needed him to decide that her dignity mattered more than a moment of laughter. Trevor swallowed. The friend looked at him. "I didn't tell you that to make you feel worse." "I know." Trevor nodded slowly. "But I'm glad you told me." The friend said nothing else. Neither did Trevor. When they went back inside, Naomi looked toward him. Trevor met her eyes. He did not tell her what had been said. Not yet. He knew the words were connected to her experience, and he did not want to use them carelessly. Instead, he walked over and asked, "Ready to go?" Naomi considered the question, then nodded. "Yeah." They left together. The drive home was quiet at first, not the frightening silence Trevor had learned to fear after the rooftop. A different kind, comfortable, thoughtful. Naomi looked out the passenger side window. Trevor kept both hands on the steering wheel. After several minutes, Naomi said, "You handled tonight differently." Trevor glanced at her briefly. "I hope so." Naomi smiled faintly. "That wasn't a compliment." "I know." She turned toward him. Trevor smiled. That wasn't me fishing for one. Naomi looked away again. This time, she laughed. A real laugh. Trevor smiled but kept driving. After a while, Naomi said, "I noticed." Trevor nodded. "Okay. That's it?" "That's it." Naomi shook her head. "You really are trying." Trevor felt warmth move through him. But he did not turn toward her and ask what she meant. He did not ask whether she trusted him. He did not ask whether she had decided to stay. He let the sentence remain what it was, an observation, not a guarantee. When they arrived home, Trevor unlocked the apartment. Naomi entered first. He followed her inside. Nothing dramatic had happened that night. No grand apology, no declaration, no moment that could be replayed later as proof that everything had been repaired. But Trevor understood something now. The change Naomi needed to see was not whether he could behave differently when she was watching. It was whether he would remain accountable when nobody was forcing him to be. Whether the decision to respect her would survive ordinary conversations. Whether it would survive his desire for attention. Whether it would survive awkwardness. Whether it would survive moments when nobody would know the difference. Trevor looked at Naomi as she placed her bag down. She had once said she did not know if he would ever think her pain mattered enough to stop. He could not go back and change how long it had taken him to understand. He could not ask her to forget the years before. All he could do was keep answering the question differently, not with another promise, with what he chose to do next. A few weeks after the gathering, Trevor and Naomi sat together at the kitchen table on an ordinary Thursday night. There was nothing special about the evening. Dinner had been simple. The dishes were clean. Naomi had changed into comfortable clothes after work, and Trevor had been answering emails before closing his laptop. For a while, neither of them spoke. Months earlier, Trevor would have noticed the silence and immediately wondered whether something was wrong. Now he had learned that silence could mean many things. Sometimes it meant Naomi was tired. Sometimes it meant she was thinking. Sometimes it simply meant neither of them had anything to say. He no longer treated every quiet moment as a problem he needed to solve. Naomi looked across the table. "Can I ask you something?" Trevor closed the laptop. "Sure." "Do you miss it?" He frowned. "Miss what? Being able to joke about anything you want?" Trevor leaned back. The question deserved more than a quick answer. For a moment, he thought about the old version of himself. The man who believed every interesting moment became better when shared. The man who confused an audience's laughter with proof that nothing was wrong. The man who felt restricted whenever someone asked him to consider another person's boundaries. Finally, Trevor said, "I think I confused having no boundaries with being free." Naomi looked at him. Trevor continued, "I used to think that if I had to stop and ask whether something was appropriate to share, then I was censoring myself." Naomi listened. "But that wasn't freedom." He paused. "It was me expecting other people to carry the cost of whatever I wanted to say." Naomi lowered her eyes. Trevor looked at his hands. "I thought being funny meant I could turn anything into a story." "What do you think now?" "I think not everything belongs to me just because I was there." Naomi nodded. Trevor continued, "And being married to you doesn't mean I own your side of our life." For a moment, Naomi said nothing. Then she said, "That's something I needed you to understand for a long time." "I know." Trevor looked up. "And I'm sorry it took you reaching your limit before I listened." Naomi did not answer immediately. Trevor did not wait for her to. After a moment she said, "I've been thinking about something too." Trevor listened. "I kept believing that keeping the peace was protecting our marriage." He nodded slowly. "But sometimes I was protecting the pattern." Trevor remained quiet. Naomi looked toward the kitchen window. "I was afraid of becoming difficult." Trevor felt something tighten inside him. "You weren't difficult. I know that now." She gave a small, sad smile. "But for a long time I thought every time I spoke up, I had to make sure I had enough evidence." Trevor remembered asking Naomi for examples. He remembered demanding explanations. He remembered turning every conversation into a discussion about whether her feelings were justified. Naomi continued, "So I kept the peace until I couldn't." Trevor said nothing. "I laughed when I was hurt. I accepted apologies because I wanted the tension to end. I waited until I had collected too much pain before saying anything." She looked at him. "That was my mistake." Trevor's expression changed. Naomi lifted her hand. "And I know what you're thinking." He stopped. "That doesn't make your behavior my fault." "No. But I needed to understand why I stayed inside a pattern that was hurting me." Trevor nodded. "I understand." Naomi looked at him. Then he corrected himself. "You needed to understand it for yourself." "Yes." The room became quiet again. This silence felt different. It was not a weapon. It was not punishment. It was simply space where both of them could hear what had finally been said. Trevor looked at Naomi. "I used to think you stopped talking to punish me." Naomi's face changed. "I know. But you weren't trying to punish me." "No." Trevor waited. Naomi looked down. "I stopped explaining because I was tired." He said nothing. "Tired of finding new words for the same thing." Trevor felt his chest tighten. Naomi continued. "Every conversation started to feel like a test I had to pass." She looked back at him. "I had to explain what happened, why it hurt, why I thought it mattered, and why I was allowed to be upset." Trevor could not look away. "And if I couldn't explain it perfectly, you acted like maybe you had a reason not to take it seriously." His throat tightened. Naomi's voice remained calm. "That's when I started losing faith." Trevor nodded slowly. "The silence?" "Yes." Naomi took a breath. "The silence was never supposed to punish you." Trevor listened. It was the point where another explanation no longer felt useful. The words stayed with him. He thought about the rooftop. He thought about Naomi placing her drink down and picking up her bag. At the time, he had followed her because he expected an argument. He had been almost offended by her silence. He had believed she owed him an explanation for leaving. But Naomi had already explained. For years. The rooftop had not created the problem. It had exposed the point at which she no longer believed speaking would change anything. Trevor looked down. "I hear you." Naomi studied him. Trevor gave a small nod. "I'm not saying I understand every part of what you lived through." He looked back at her. "But I finally understand what I kept missing." Naomi waited. "You were telling me that something was hurting you." Trevor's voice was quiet. "And instead of asking myself why I kept doing it, I kept asking you why you were hurt." Naomi did not look away. Trevor continued. "I made you defend your pain." Her eyes became wet. He did not move. He did not reach across the table. He allowed her to have the moment without making it about his need to comfort her or be forgiven. Naomi wiped beneath one eye. Trevor remained where he was. After a while she asked, "Do you know what I've decided?" Trevor's heart began beating harder. He did not answer immediately. Naomi had told him months earlier not to assume she was staying. He had tried to live with that. He had stopped asking for a decision. Now she was offering one. "What?" Naomi took a breath. "I want to stay." Trevor closed his eyes for a moment. The relief was immediate. But he kept it inside himself. When he opened his eyes again, Naomi was watching him. "I'm not saying everything is fixed. I know. I'm not saying I trust you the way I did before." Trevor nodded. "I know. And I'm not promising I'll never feel cautious again. You don't have to." Naomi looked at him for several seconds. "I want to stay because things are different." Trevor listened. "Not perfect. No. Different." He nodded. Naomi continued. "And because I'm different too." Trevor waited. "I'm not going back to laughing at things that hurt me just to keep the room comfortable." He nodded. "I don't want you to. I'm going to tell you when something crosses a boundary. Okay? And I'm not going to spend an hour building a case before I'm allowed to say it." Trevor gave a small smile. "Good." Naomi's expression softened. Trevor leaned back in his chair. He wanted to tell her how grateful he was. He wanted to tell her how relieved he felt. But Naomi had not chosen to stay so he could feel better about himself. She had chosen because the relationship had become something she was willing to continue evaluating honestly. Trevor understood that staying was not the same as returning to the past. She was not stepping back into the marriage they had before. Neither was he. They were choosing what came next. Trevor finally said, "Thank you." Naomi nodded. "And?" Trevor smiled faintly. "And I know I still have work to do." Naomi smiled. "A lot of work, I know." "Good." They both laughed. The laughter was small, but it belonged to both of them. Months later, Trevor still had moments when he caught himself. The old habit had been practiced for too long to disappear from his memory completely. Sometimes a private detail would seem perfect for a story. Sometimes he would feel the old desire to make himself entertaining by using the people closest to him. But now he stopped, sometimes before speaking, sometimes after beginning a sentence. And when he made mistakes, he did not turn the apology into another performance. He listened, he accepted the discomfort. Then he changed what he did next. Naomi changed too. She became more direct. If something bothered her, she said so earlier. If she did not want to attend an event, she said no. If Trevor shared something carelessly, she did not wait until resentment had grown before addressing it. Their marriage was not suddenly effortless. They still disagreed about money. They still changed plans. Trevor still occasionally forgot things. Naomi still sometimes needed time before talking. But the arguments no longer followed the same path. Trevor no longer treated Naomi's emotions as something she had to prove. Naomi no longer treated silence as the only safe alternative when speaking felt useless. They began dealing with the pattern instead of arguing only about individual moments. And over time, that mattered more than either of them had expected. Because intention did not erase impact. Humor without respect could become humiliation. Repeated apologies without changed behavior eventually lost their meaning. Avoiding conflict could protect the very pattern causing harm. Trust did not return because someone promised it would. It returned through repeated experiences, through the ordinary moments when a person showed again and again that your vulnerability would be handled with care. Love needed boundaries to remain safe, and private pain should never become public entertainment without the person's consent. Trevor understood all of that now, but his clearest understanding came from Naomi's silence. For years he had believed silence meant she was done being upset. Then, for one frightening stretch of time, he believed it meant she was punishing him. He had been wrong both times. Her silence had meant something much simpler. She had run out of faith that another explanation would matter. And when Trevor finally understood that, he stopped asking why she had stopped speaking. He began asking why he had needed her to reach that point before he truly listened. That was the question he intended to keep answering for the rest of his life. Not with another speech, not with another apology, but with what he chose to do when Naomi trusted him with something that was not his to turn into a joke. And perhaps that was the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes the person you love has been telling you exactly what is hurting them. Not once, not twice, but for years. The tragedy is not always that you never heard them. Sometimes you heard every word. You simply did not believe you needed to change until they finally stopped saying it. Have you ever stayed silent not because you had nothing to say, but because you were tired of saying the same thing and watching nothing change? And if you realized someone you loved had been telling you they were hurting for years, would you truly listen? Or would you only notice when they finally stopped speaking? If this story made you think about the way we treat the people closest to us, share your thoughts in the comments. Like the video if you believe private pain should never become public entertainment, and subscribe to Mr. Wisdom Stories for more fictional stories about human choices, unexpected turns, and the things we sometimes learn too late. Sometimes the loudest warning in a relationship is not an argument. Sometimes it is the moment the person who has been trying to explain finally decides there is nothing left to say.